Today's material is a highly conversational, passionate defense of Erika, Kirk, and Turning Point USA against public criticisms made by Candace Owens. Integrating sponsor reads organically is crucial to maintaining the emotional momentum of a passionate argument. So let's look closely at the section discussing the opponent's behavior. We are, right in the middle of a deeply intense section dissecting an aggressive behavioral obsession.
Right.
It's dealing with the aftermath of a murdered husband, and then, the text just moves directly into a sudden pitch for Ridge wallets.
Yeah,
It is incredibly jarring. I mean, to me, it feels exactly like a tense courtroom drama, pausing right before the jury reads the final verdict, just so the defense attorney can sell the jury a hot dog.
That courtroom analogy is spot on because it highlights exactly what is breaking down, which is the psychological contract between the writer and the audience.
The psychological contract, right.
Yeah, when you're writing about an incredibly sensitive, heavy topic, like the tragic aftermath of a murdered husband, or, defending a widow's grief against public attacks, you are asking your audience to do a lot of emotional heavy lifting.
For sure. You're asking for their empathy.
Empathy, their outrage, and their vulnerability. They are leaning in. You have successfully built a tremendous amount of narrative tension. And then, without any warning, the text abruptly pivots into a casual, colloquial read about George Costanza wallets, carbon fiber, and titanium.
Oh, yeah. It's just a total collision. You're reading about this intense, high-stakes public feud and the preservation of a legacy. And in the exact same breath, you're being told how slim and indestructible this piece of metal in your pocket is.
Right, and the fundamental weakness here is that this abrupt collision completely deflates the gravity of the argument.
It really does.
It creates severe emotional whiplash. I mean, think about the mechanics of how we process information. When an audience is fully engaged in empathizing with a tragedy, while their emotional bandwidth is saturated.
Completely full.
Exactly. If you suddenly introduce a commercial transaction into that space, you aren't just changing the subject. You're actively undermining the sincerity you just worked so hard to establish.
Which is dangerous.
Very. It subtly signals to the reader that the preceding grief and outrage might just be like a vehicle for a sales pitch. It makes the audience feel slightly manipulated, even if that wasn't the author's intention at all.
I can completely understand the necessity of it, though. I mean, creators need to sustain their platforms. Monetization is just a reality of the landscape.
Oh, absolutely.
We can't just tell them not to make a living. So how do we fix this structural issue without losing the revenue stream? I mean, we need a way to protect the emotional momentum while still paying the bills.
Well, the key is structural isolation. You have to quarantine the sponsor read so that it doesn't bleed into the serious commentary.
Quarantine it, right.
Yeah, you are building a very specific emotional environment. You need to install a sturdy door before you just completely change the scenery.
So practically speaking, what does that look like on the page or in the audio?
The cleanest, most effective way to handle this is to relocate the sponsor read entirely. Like, move the advertisement to the very beginning of the piece as a pre-roll.
Okay.
Or put it at the very end as a post-roll. By moving the commercial aspect to the absolute periphery of the content, you leave the emotional core intact and uninterrupted.
That makes a lot of sense.
The audience can process the heavy subject matter from the first word to the last without having their immersion broken. They know the ad is separate from the commentary.
That definitely preserves the flow. But, what if they don't have that flexibility? What if they are contractually obligated to place the ad right in the middle of the material? We see that all the time with mid-roll requirements.
Yeah, that happens a lot. If a mid-roll is absolutely non-negotiable, then they need to build a deliberate, thematic bridge. They need to purposely break the tension themselves rather than letting the ad accidentally shatter it.
Like using a clear professional transitional bumper?
Yes, exactly.
Something like, we're going to dive deeper into the psychology behind this feud and the implications for the legacy involved in a moment. But first, a quick word from our sponsors.
Exactly that. And let's unpack why a bumper like that works. It acts as a cognitive palate cleanser.
Right. It gives them a second to breathe.
Yeah, by explicitly stating, "We're going to pause," you are giving the audience permission to momentarily step out of the heavy narrative. You're acknowledging the shift in tone.
It tells the reader, I know what we are talking about is serious.
Right, and I respect your emotional investment enough to warn you that a commercial is coming. They listen to the ad, and then you respectfully invite them back into the serious discussion afterward. It creates a boundary that protects the integrity of the main argument.
It honors the audience's emotional investment by treating them like adults who understand the business model rather than just springing a trapdoor on them.
Spot on.
Speaking of honoring the audience's investment, you can't just do that structurally. You have to maintain it tonally, too.
Yes.
Which brings us to the actual arguments being made and how the authors present themselves in the text. Aligning stated values with actual rhetorical focus ensures the audience fully trusts the narrative voice.
It really does.
As I understand it from the text, a core pillar of the author's argument is that they do not care about superficial metric. They explicitly claim they're above the fray of numbers, fame, or ratioing on social media.
They make that very clear, yes.
They even drop this genuinely brilliant line pointing out that Jesus only had 12 followers. It perfectly establishes their priorities.
It's a great line.
It is. But then almost immediately, the text spends a significant amount of time highlighting how the authors blocked 500 people.
Right.
And how much they loved watching those people go crazy.
Right.
And they get deep into the weeds analyzing who is responding to whom. So I have to push back on the logic of the writing here. Doesn't dedicating so much breath and energy to the mechanics of social media inherently prove that you do in fact care about it deeply?
You've hit on the exact contradiction that is weakening the piece. The vulnerability here lies in the tonal inconsistency, which creates a classic, protesting too much vibe.
Oh, totally.
Let's look at the psychology of what's happening. The authors do an excellent job of explicitly attacking their opponent for being what they call a narcissistic sociopath weirdo.
Because they obsess over having the #1 podcast.
Right, bragging about gajillions of followers and pushing endless merchandise. The authors are attempting to establish a stark contrast and claim the moral high ground.
Yeah.
But when they continually gloat about mass-blocking cult members and focus so heavily on the granular, petty mechanics of internet feuding, they inadvertently descend right into the exact same behavioral arena they are criticizing.
Right, it's like loudly criticizing someone for being obsessed with a high school basketball game, while you were standing on the sidelines aggressively keeping score and shouting at the referees.
Precisely. And we see this happen all the time in persuasive writing when the author feels defensive. When you feel attacked, there is a natural human urge to prove that you are winning.
Or at least that you aren't bothered.
Exactly. That you are completely unbothered. You want to show the audience that you have the upper hand. But by focusing so heavily on your own block lists and Twitter mentions, you completely undermine your core message.
It totally backfires.
It does. If your stated value is that you care about lasting legacy, deep faith, and substantive real-world missions, but your rhetorical focus keeps drifting back to how much fun you had blocking 500 trolls on a Tuesday, well, the audience begins to distrust your narrator.
The stated values and the actual focus are at war with one another.
Yes, exactly.
I see exactly how that dissonance happens. You want to show you're unbothered, but the mere act of explaining how unbothered you are just proves you're bothered. The material makes a really strong case for the opponent's vanity, but it trips over its own anecdotes.
It really does.
So they really just need to streamline this commentary, don't they?
Aggressively streamline it, yes. They must focus the lens entirely on the opponent's vanity and completely strip away any of their own social media management anecdotes.
Just get rid of them.
Right. The goal of this section should be to make the opponent's obsession with numbers look shallow. The only way to effectively do that is to contrast it against a narrative voice that genuinely, demonstrably does not engage with those numbers at all.
So they just need to cut that whole anecdote about blocking 500 people. I know it probably felt incredibly cathartic to write. I mean, we've all wanted to mass block people and laugh about it.
Oh, sure we have.
But it totally torpedoes their moral high ground. It feels petty, which is the exact opposite of the graceful, above-the-fray image they're trying to project.
Exactly. Catharsis for the writer often translates to pettiness for the reader. Cutting that anecdote removes the distraction. You have to kill your darlings to save the argument.
Right.
Once that self-referential social media talk is gone, they can reframe the discussion of metrics entirely around the opponent. Emphasize how the opponent's focus on merch, and my numbers directly distracts from the core substantive mission of Turning Point USA.
Frame the opponent's vanity not just as a character flaw, but as a roadblock to actual, real-world impact.
Yes, exactly. When the authors completely remove themselves from the social media scoreboard, their critique of the opponent's vanity hits with twice the force.
Because it comes from a place of genuine, unbothered authority.
Right. It says, look at this person obsessing over their merchandise.
while we are trying to do real work. That is a devastating argument, but it only works if the authors aren't also talking about their own Twitter metrics.
It's all about maintaining altitude. You can't criticize someone for being in the mud if you're throwing mud back at them. And retaining that moral high ground naturally leads us to the specific choice of vocabulary used throughout the piece. Anchoring character critiques and specific, undeniable actions yields a much stronger argument than relying on intense personal insults.
It really is night and day.
Let's look at the heavy use of extreme descriptors in the source material. We see terms borrowed from the Daily Mail and generated by the authors themselves. Phrases like soulless ghoul, bitch, retarded, and freaking demon.
Yeah, very charged language.
I really have to ask, does this level of vitriol actually serve the author's stated goal of presenting themselves and Erika as graceful, godly figures navigating a tragedy?
That is the vital question, and it highlights a major weakness in the completeness and focus of the argument. Let's really dig into the mechanics of persuasion here. Relying on ad hominem attacks and mocking past endeavors like, bringing up the opponent's old Explore talent profile or hip-hop videos, it fundamentally distracts the audience from the actual substantive critique.
It gets totally derailed.
Exactly. Now, let's be clear. We can completely see and feel the genuine anger in the write. And given the context of a grieving widow being attacked, well, that anger is entirely justified.
Oh, completely justified.
But translating that anger into highly abrasive playground-style language undermines the author's own self-identification.
Because they consistently identify throughout the text as flawed but faithful Christians attempting to preserve a legacy.
Right. When you repeatedly identify as a preserver of faith and legacy, but then you pivot to using words like soulless ghoul and demon, you create a jarring character break for the reader.
It's just a huge clash.
It is. But even beyond the tonal mismatch, let's look at this from a purely strategic standpoint. Using that kind of extreme vocabulary gives your opponent an incredibly easy out.
It gives the opponent a shield made entirely out of the author's own aggressive vocabulary, right?
Yes.
Because if someone critiques you using undeniable facts, you have to defend your actions. But if they critique you by calling you a bitch or a demon, you don't have to defend your actions at all.
Not at all.
You can just turn to your audience and dismiss the author as a hater, a troll, or just someone resorting to name-calling. It completely dilutes the power of the argument.
That is exactly how the mechanics of a public feud work. You never want to give your opponent an easy reason to dismiss you. When an author uses words like freaking demon, they're doing the thinking for the reader. They are demanding the reader feel a certain way.
And readers naturally resist being told how to feel. They want to come to their own conclusions.
Exactly. They want to connect the dots themselves. The suggestion here isn't to dilute the anger, though. Righteous indignation is an incredibly powerful rhetorical tool.
So how do you use it effectively?
The suggestion is to shift that exact same intense energy away from inherent insult and redirect it toward precise, undeniable descriptions of the opponent's behavior and its real-world impact.
Focus on the actions.
Right. Anger expressed through devastating facts is vastly more persuasive than anger expressed through name-calling.
I love that distinction, anger through facts rather than anger through insults. How can they practically apply that shift in the text? I mean, we know they need to remove labels like freaking demon or soulless ghoul, but what do they replace that intense emotion with?
They replace it by leaning heavily into the powerful juxtaposition that they've actually already seeded later in the text.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah, there is a moment where the authors note that Turning Point USA was actively bringing college and high school kids to Christ.
Right.
And the opponent chose to publicly attack and attempt to destroy that specific charitable momentum during a grieving period. That is incredibly powerful.
It really hits hard.
It does. They just need to lay that juxtaposition out starkly. Detail the charitable work being done on one side, and detail the choice to attack a widow for engagement metrics on the other.
It's the ultimate execution of showing rather than telling.
Exactly. If you give the audience the raw, stark facts of that behavior, the reader will sit back and think, wow, that behavior is absolutely ghastly.
And that's so much better.
Right. That organic realization from the reader is 100 times more powerful than the author just screaming, she's a ghoul on the page.
So true.
You have to rigorously frame the critique around the opponent's actions rather than their inherent being. Instead of writing, she is a narcissist, you write, she chose to capitalize on a fresh tragedy to boost her engagement metrics and sell merchandise.
It keeps the argument rooted in factual, observable reality rather than subjective insult.
Absolutely.
When you focus on those undeniable actions, the specific timing of the attacks, the monetization of the controversy, you build an ironclad case.
You really do.
The opponent cannot simply brush off a timeline of their own actions as petty name-call. It elevates the entire piece from a defensive internet feud into a definitive, authoritative critique of behavior.
Completely elevates it.
Well, we've covered some really crucial ground today, looking at both the structural boundaries and the rhetorical mechanics of this material. So, to concisely recap our three main takeaways for the listener. First, protecting the emotional momentum of your piece is paramount.
Always.
By structurally separating your ad reads, whether by moving them to the pre-roll, the post-roll, or using a distinct, respectful transitional bumper, you ensure the heavy gravity of your argument isn't shattered by a sudden sale.
Crucial first step.
Of the petty fray of social media metrics, you have to strip away your own anecdotes about blocking users and focus your fire solely on the opponent's vanities as a distraction from real-world impact.
Yes, perfectly stated.
Finally, strengthening your character critiques means moving away from personal insults and playground language. Anchor your justified anger in the opponent's undeniable actions, allowing the stark facts of their behavior to make the devastating argument for you.
Exactly right.
If you're the author of this piece, try applying these structural boundaries and tightening up that rhetorical focus. We would absolutely love to see how this material evolves, so please implement these specific, actionable suggestions and submit your revised work back to the critique so we can dive into it again.